Thank you, Riley, and all our presenters. Yes, we'll now move into the question and answer session. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A box on your Zoom toolbar to enter questions. We will log those and respond to as many as we can tonight. And if you're participating in the RTC conference room, you can write questions down on the paper, provide those to the staff there in the room, and they will get those over to us. I will note before we get started on the Q&A, we have many participants on this afternoon. We really appreciate that. I think this is our highest attended info session so far. As a result of that, that means we've also received nearly 100 questions already in the Q&A box. I know some have been addressed through the presentation. We'll try to group as many as we can to respond to, but we apologize if we don't get through all the questions. So with that, I'm going to read two questions that relate to each other, related to ridership, to get us started. So those two questions ask, how do you validate models and measure their performance? And along with that question, do you have any examples of modeled ridership versus actual ridership for the same project, showing whatever the difference may have been? And what level of confidence do you have in model predictions? And Riley, do you want to get us started with that response?
I do. Thank you, Tiffany. And those are great questions. For that, I'm going to ask Matt if he has an opportunity to respond. And if Matt, you need to have the question repeated, please go ahead and ask.
Great. Thanks, Riley. I think I captured the essence of both of those questions. And I'd note that those are often types of questions that come up as part of a ridership forecasting process. I think one speaks to, to the extent that how can we be confident in the results, and how are we kind of comparing things to maybe other systems that have been built. One thing to note is that the webinar from last fall did include some ridership comparisons to other systems as to how well kind of other systems like SMART and the Coaster and Sprinter service, they developed ridership forecasts before those systems were built. And now we have the benefit of those systems being up and operational for several years. And we did take a look at those. And what we found is actually the forecasting results for most of those systems were fairly consistent with the actual ridership numbers that they're seeing. And so at least in some of our comparison systems, we have the benefit of those ridership results being fairly accurate. There's a caveat there that travel patterns and conditions are changing a lot. We've all seen a lot of changes in travel demand and travel trends since COVID, and we're working to try and incorporate kind of the latest changes in travel trends into some of the models here. But we know that, there's still, we don't have that crystal ball. We have tools that we hope will be useful. And we're attempting to account for factors like post-COVID travel demand and travel patterns in our results, and using the latest modeling tools and approaches to develop the ridership forecasts that we shared today. That's one reason why we have sort of the combined approach that I was describing of the county travel demand model with the direct ridership modeling tool, where we intend to use those together. And we hope that results in an approach that gives us the best of both worlds for looking at ridership numbers. So I think hopefully that answers the question in terms of the overall process and how we're thinking about performance of the models. Maybe actually the other thing I'd note is that the county travel demand model is a model that has been validated at various points since it was originally developed over 10 years ago. And so we're using the latest version of that model that has gone through prior validation processes, collected data on regional travel patterns within Santa Cruz County, and then compared that to the model forecasts to calibrate it to have it be as accurate as possible for local travel conditions.
Thanks, Matt. And as Matt mentioned, one of our previous information sessions, just to remind everybody, all of the previous info sessions that we've done for this project are all posted on the project webpage on the RTC's website, as well as those linked to YouTube. So thanks, Matt. Okay, our next question also relates to ridership. And the question is, what is the difference between riders and boardings in numbers?
I'm happy to take that one too, Riley.
That'd be great.
Sounds
That'd
good.
be great, Matt. Yep.
I think that's a fairly simple question, and the answer really is they're the same. Boardings would be measured is the typical way of looking at ridership, but it's the number of people getting on the train, and so that would be the same as the total riders throughout the day. So one boarding equals one rider, if you will, and I think that's probably the most direct way of describing it. So if you hear riders, if you hear boardings, I would consider those the same.
Okay, thank you. The next question is going to relate to both ridership and cost. And the question asks, in the TCAA, the Transit Corridor Alternatives Analysis that was prepared in 2020, light rail forecast higher ridership than commuter rail. Would we have high ridership if we included more stops? And then related to that, we also have a question asking if the cost estimates included a light rail version. So Riley, I will let you get started with that one.
Perfect. And I'll answer part of it and then get over to Matt for the second half of the question. So to answer, was light rail included in the cost estimate? And the answer is no. Light rail itself was not specifically costed out as an option for the zero emission passenger rail and trail cost estimates that we presented today. The reason being is that at the March 20th commission meeting, the RTC commission directed staff to align the zero emission passenger rail and trail project with the vision of the state rail plan, which was intercity rail on the Santa Cruz Branch rail line. And I think to answer one of the other questions I saw to come through as well, yes, the Santa Cruz Branch rail line is included in the state rail plan and is a spur of the Central Coast Corridor, which is included in the federally Corridor Identification Development Program corridor for the Central Coast Corridor. So I'll let Matt go into some more detail on it, but generally speaking, when you look at ridership and the number of stations do go hand in hand and are interrelated. But along with that is also the trade-off that when you have a larger number of stations or stops, the travel time for the system increases, and that also affects ridership. So Matt, with that, I'll toss it over to you, and you can expand just a little bit on how that affects the ridership numbers and how that would interplay with a light rail system. Where are we to look at that?
Sure, happy to describe that, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Overall, is that in ridership forecasting and even thinking about kind of how people travel in general, sure, it might be convenient to have a rail stop maybe closer to where you live or to where you work. But if that's not something that's kind of part of the overall kind of current plan, you're adding a rail stop and you slow down the rail service for everybody else. So there is that trade-off that's inherent in transit, kind of thinking about transit stops and locations as part of the project team's discussions and kind of thinking about the ridership. We've attempted to sort of find that right balance between the optimal number of stations that kind of gets to a lot of where the travel demand originates and ends, so where population and employment centers are, but to balance that against maybe that need to or that kind of desire to have more stops that would slow down the overall service. And so we wouldn't achieve those levels of a 40 to 45 minute end-to-end travel time if we added several stops along the way. We've attempted to strike that right balance in the ridership process so far. We've also looked at the type of rail service. Light rail service does oftentimes have more stops, but maybe slightly lower capacities on the trains compared to other types of trains. That was looked at in detail in the transit corridor alternatives analysis several years ago. And I'd say that a lot of those forecasts are helpful in looking at the trade-offs between different types of transit. We focus sort of on the ZEPRT type service and the ridership forecast here. But for comparison purposes, I think the TCAA ridership results do show some of those differences between different types of transit technologies.
Back to you, Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you both. My next set of questions kind of speak to the need for a little bit of clarification around what future-looking elements we're including here related to ridership. So I'm going to read two of these questions. Hopefully, Riley and Matt, you can speak to this a little better. The first one is, does this future ridership estimate assume we build 100% of the housing elements? And what is the projected population you're using for this? And then related to that, there's a question that the executive summary seemed to indicate that additional housing that will be built by our horizon year were not included in the ridership study, such as the Santa Cruz downtown expansion project and the Watsonville housing element. And the question is, why were these housing elements not included? So I know that was a handful, but maybe we can speak to what elements have been included and why or why not.
Perfect. Yeah. I think that question gets at a couple different things, but we can probably summarize it pretty quickly in terms of what the study looked at and how the ridership projections were put together. And I think part of that comes from the executive summary, as was mentioned in the question, tells us that specifically the downtown specific plan, the Watsonville downtown specific plan, which is an adopted plan, was included in developing the projections for ridership, whereas some of the other elements of land use planning for Santa Cruz County may not have been specifically included in the ridership modeling. So I think, and then, to get to our housing element quotas as determined by the state of California, some of these specific plans and general plan updates are making it possible for the community to reach those numbers. But I think, Matt, can you just speak specifically as to differentiating between like the Watsonville specific downtown plan versus how we incorporate the kind of general growth projections for our community that may be captured by like a future general plan update?
Absolutely, happy to. Understanding local land use plans as well as kind of broader kind of growth projections is a key part of the ridership process. I will say that that any adopted plan, we're at this point attempting to include all of the growth that is assumed as part of an adopted and fully approved plan. So that would include, for example, like Riley mentioned, the downtown Watsonville specific plan, which did envision a fair amount of growth in the downtown area of Watsonville and was adopted within the last couple of years. The county of Santa Cruz recently adopted a new general plan that governed growth throughout the county. And those numbers are incorporated into the ridership projections. For planning efforts that are underway or maybe don't have a plan that is fully adopted, those aren't yet included, but to the extent that it might be appropriate to do so once those plans maybe are fully adopted, I think it's We recently, I think, had the downtown expansion plan in Santa Cruz get adopted, or at least it's in that final approval process. So to the extent that that might be something to consider in kind of future refinements, we would do so. But at this point, the ridership forecasts are based on everything that has been adopted and approved throughout the county. But we also are attempting to track and monitor efforts that are underway and may be approved at some point in the near future.
Thanks, Matt. And yeah, the downtown expansion plan, for instance, is recommended for adoption, but not yet adopted by the city. Thank you for that answer. And back to you, Tiffany.
All right. Our next question also relates to ridership and stations. And the question asks, it looks as though the 41st Avenue rail stop was eliminated, which doesn't make sense because it's close to significant shopping and therefore allows access to shopping for people coming directly from neighborhoods along the rail line. It would be ideal if every rail stop does not need to be a big, long station, but can be a simpler stop, more like a bus stop. This also speaks to the area around Ohlone Parkway that has a large population. And the question asks, why would two of the most potentially used stops be eliminated, especially when this could undermine optimizing service to commuters and regular shoppers? Ideally, we want regular shoppers and commuters to avoid driving. And I think I will pause there. Riley, let you start that one.
Yeah. So thinking back to Matt's earlier question, or answer to the question about the number of stations that we have versus the travel time, and how when we look at developing a system, you're trying to balance those two. And while it may seem advantageous to put a large number of stops in to be able to make it more convenient for more people to access the train and the service, when you're doing that, you're adding travel time and therefore kind of increasing increasing the time that a rider would need to travel on the train, and therefore there's a balance in there where you're trying to optimize both of them. If you have too long of a travel time, then you're going to lose ridership. And I think Mark, you might have an opportunity to explain particularly like the 41st Avenue station and what our thought was with more detail on consolidating that with the other Capitola station.
Yeah, sure. As we went through, and it was not a part of the presentation this evening, but it will be a part of I think it's part of the broader conversation. It's also on the virtual open house material that will be available here for you to review and comment on over the summer. But as we went through and looked at the travel time and looked at finding that sweet spot between the number of stations, the travel time, and what it means for ridership, Matt and his team went through and prioritized all of the station locations that had been looked at initially. And that was from two perspectives. One was looking at the propensity of those stations to specifically attract riders who are looking at, say, work or school trips. And then the others were for other activities. So not a traditional trip that you make 5 days a week, but whether it's, say, going somewhere in the evening, going just somewhere for a day, to lunch, to a shorter trip, or shopping, and taking those into account. And from that conversation, we prioritized then and looked at the stations and then compared them back to the work that Matt and his team had done as a part of the TCAA study to look at what the balance was between some of those locations and what made the most sense. As this project and this process continue to move forward, those are certainly things that can continue to be evaluated and looked at, and will be looked at as we take this project through the environmental process. But the locations and the way that they were prioritized and selected were the things that we knew from data and from the work that Matt and his team has done before, were the locations that were had the highest likelihood of best serving the travel markets in the corridor. I will point out, because again, there were a lot of questions in here about ridership. And there are a couple that had to do with the travel time specifically, and whether or not we had looked at it from the comparison, for example, of the time to drive from, say, from Santa Cruz to Watsonville. And right now at a travel time of 45 minutes, that's pretty competitive with the time it would take you to drive in a car. Obviously, there are times of the day where that drive time is more significant, and that's the time of day you might be more apt to take the train versus drive because of the time advantage that you have. And those are all things that also influence that determination on making that trip. If we add stations, there was another question here about dwell time. So that's when a train pulls into the station, how long is it going to sit for people to get on and off the train and then continue on its way? For modeling and operations purposes, basically, for the time it takes the train to slow down, come into a station, stop for about a minute, and then, or a minute and a half, and then begin on its way out of the station again, basically adds 2 minutes to the travel time. So if you look at the length of the line, and let's just say we added 3 stations and that adds 6 minutes, now with that trip being closer to an hour, is that going to be less influential to people in terms of them making a different choice in terms of how they travel? It is a chess game that will continue and always continues through the project development process and refinement. But again, we welcome the comment and the questions. At this point, with the work that we've done and what we've collected, we believe that we're in a good spot in terms of the competitiveness of the number of stations and the time that it would take to travel the line. Riley?
Thank you, Mark. And back to you, Tiffany.
Sure. The next question we have is asking if we could speak to how capital cost contingencies are determined.
Yep. Thank you, Tiffany. So in a nutshell, the contingencies are determined based on the level of design that you have, as well as basically how many of the questions that we have about what the final design would look like are still unanswered. For maybe just a little bit further detail on that, Mark, can you explain how we developed our contingency for this cost estimates?
Sure, be glad to. So I think it's the easiest way to define this is that it's a way of managing risk. With the degree of design and what we know about the project at this point, there are a lot of things that continue to be unknowns that will evolve through the environmental process. And as we learn more about site conditions as a project moves into final design. And the risk is that we learn something that we don't know right now, and that pushes the cost of the project up over time. Many of the particularly federal agencies that provide grant funding for projects such as this one have guidelines in terms of how much contingency should be at a minimum carried at different stages of a project. And at this stage, that range is typically in the range of 30 to 35%. Understanding that when we believe that there's a greater risk in terms of unknowns, that there may be additional risk that's added to accommodate for that. So you will recall in the conversation we had specifically about the bridges and the buildup of the cost of the bridges, one of the big concerns is the availability of skilled crews and the ability to access and mobilize a construction crew within some of the bridge areas given where those bridges are located. And so in that case, for the bridge construction, we increased the contingency rate to 50% just for the bridge construction. But for the other elements of the project, primarily have kept that risk in the 30 to 35% range. So overall, as a number, it's closer to 40%. I'm sorry, I don't remember the number off the top of my head. But it's variable depending on the risk that's associated with some of the individual elements of the project. The idea with contingency is is as we answer questions and we get more knowledgeable about the environmental situations, the things we have to address as it relates to mitigation, as we understand soil conditions and what that means for bridge construction. If we don't use that contingency because we didn't learn something that is going to cost more, then that's a risk that we essentially retire and the contingency will start to come down. But at this point, it's essentially the insurance policy to make sure that as a project moves forward, there aren't risks that come forward that would significantly impact the cost of the project in a way that's detrimental to the ability to achieve it. Riley?
Thank you, Mark. And I think one thing that just to highlight there is, while we've done some specific contingency consideration for the project, it's consistent with what you would see with other federal programs at this level of a project design. Back to you, Tiffany.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us back to another ridership question. And this question asks, if ridership demand exceeds initial projections, can trains be expanded with additional units, or could service frequency be increased with no change in the number of units per train? So how would we address ridership exceeding initial projections?
Great, thank you, Tiffany. And yes, multiple unit vehicles that we've been looking at are vehicles that have the capability of adding additional cars to the multiple unit set. So for instance, if we see through ridership that there's a need for increased capacity, say in the peak morning hours, those certain train sets you could add additional cars to those trains and therefore provide for additional capacity. Or if you needed the capacity throughout the day, you could have the cars be added to the vehicles for the whole portion of the day. Mark, is there anything to add on that?
No, that's a fair way to explain it, Riley, and a good question, because there are systems that do experience that, where despite how far ridership forecasting has come as a science, as Matt explained, to being pretty accurate in terms of what agencies have experienced, there are those cases where we see projects that in fact exceed the ridership forecasts. And so the ability to have flexibility and add more capacity in the system is an important part of the conversation. It's easier to add the capacity in a train than it is in the frequency of the service, only in that the line has to have certain accommodations to allow trains to pass in certain locations, and also what that means in terms of the operation of traffic and other things. But certainly we have the ability to do that through adding capacity within a multiple unit.
Great. Back to you, Tiffany.
Thanks. I'm going to shift us to a cost question now. And I've seen a few questions come in related to Beach Street in Santa Cruz. Those questions, one asks, what cost and solution is included in the cost estimate for Beach Street and the Santa Cruz Beach Boardwalk area? And I believe another question similarly asked, how can that area be designed to save cost?
Okay. So for the purpose of developing the cost estimates that were presented today, the at-grade alignment has been considered as our baseline alignment. Now, for those who have had the opportunity to read the executive summary already, which was posted on Friday, the area of Beach Street is still an area where there's some refinement that needs to happen, and where the project team and the commission are going to be continuing the conversation with stakeholders in that area to refine the project and work through some of the complex issues there. And we'll elaborate that on that topic a bit more on Thursday for those of you who are joining us at the commission meeting. I think in terms of looking at the cost through that area, it's challenging to bring down the cost through the Beach Street area. The Act rate alignment does include the costs that would be associated with not only the tracks through the area and developing what we call the guideway area. So that would include maybe some retaining walls where needed, but also includes the fencing and the crossing improvements that would be required for pedestrian safety through the area. Whereas things that we might look at in terms of making the system through the Beach Street area work more efficiently, such as maybe a grade separated pedestrian crossing or other features that would be in addition to the Act grade alignment, those costs would likely increase the project cost from what is considered in the cost estimate today. Anything to add, Mark?
No, I think that's a fair summary of agreed.
Back to you, Tiffany.
All right, thanks. The next question is a clarifying question referring to the term ridership. When we state 3,500 to 6,000 in the year 2045, it appears that we define that as boardings. In other words, are we saying that the prediction is 3,500 to 6,000 boardings per weekday?
Matt, I will pose this one over to you.
Yes, that is correct. So that would be when we're referring to ridership in general, it would be referring to boardings. I think I'll use this time to briefly clarify one of the other questions, as I saw there was another comment related to the boardings versus people. I had said that they were the same. I think the one slight amendment to that would be if, say, I get on the train in Watsonville in the morning, commute to work in Santa Cruz, and then in the afternoon, I get on the train in Santa Cruz and commute back home to Watsonville, that would be 2 boardings. I would be the same person. So like maybe that's the slight amendment to kind of boardings generally equals kind of people. But if I'm taking 2 trips, that would count as 2 boardings in terms of the ridership numbers that we're talking about here, even though I'm the same person. So generally, yeah, we want to be thinking in terms of boardings. Hopefully that's clear for some of the terms that are being discussed today.
Great, thank you, Matt. Appreciate the clarification. Back to you, Tiffany.
Sure, thanks, Riley. We have a few questions related to the funding for the project. So, for example, one of the questions says the full $4+ billion for the project couldn't all be coming from federal train incentive grants. Where would the rest of funding for the project come from?
Okay, it's a great question. And I did see several that were asking the similar vein. Yes, when you're looking at and Mark, you'll fill in the gaps for me after I give a brief answer, but when you're looking at a train, a passenger rail service such as this one, there will be federal investment in a project like this, or at least that's the expectation. And any federal investment, they're going to be looking at partners, the state and local partners that will be participating. And there's an expectation that there would be local participation as well. When you look at the different programs available, there's generally a range with historically that there might be a maximum federal participation of about 50% through the Federal Transit Administration. Whereas with the Federal Railroad Administration's program, the Corridor Identification and Development Program, which we've mentioned earlier today, that program does have 80% potential match for intercity rail program or service. Now that is caveated with those funds have to be available at the federal level, and that corridor ID program is meant to develop what they call a pipeline of projects for federal investment throughout the nation to be ready for construction. And that would be likely through the federal state partnership program of the Federal Railroad Administration, which also could invest up to that 80% federal match. But there would be a local investment required match, and that could be shared between the state and the local partners. We would not expect that the state would pony up 20% match, and the locals would not share in that cost share. So there would be an expectation that the local Santa Cruz County community would need to participate and provide part of that match to the Federal Railroad Administration and then the state partners as well. Matt or Mark, do you have any other additions to that?
No, I think that's a good summary of that, Riley. And while we've had a lot of conversation as a part of this process, specifically focused on the two primary discretionary programs of both the FRA and the FTA, through the Corridor ID program, as well as through the Capital Investment Grant program, and they do have varying levels and expectations. There's a lot of other programs out there that provide for other things that may be associated with or might similarly support elements of a project or a program or be an added benefit to it. And part of the conversation that will take place as this project continues to evolve is understanding not only the timeline for development of the project, but what the most achievable or most attainable funding sources are at the various stages of the project to ensure that what has been maximized is your ability as a community to draw on not only the federal money, but also the state resources to help match that requirement.
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
It's good to highlight that what we see today in the grant landscape might not be the same in a few years' time or several years' time, depending on our timelines for the continued progression of the project. And I think given that we're just at 5 o'clock, we have time for one more question, Tiffany.
Yeah, and there's been a few questions that have come in related to the topic you were just on that have asked about next steps and what happens if the RTC Commission approves the project concept this fall. So maybe you could speak briefly to what the next steps are.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. And like I mentioned for the answer to one of the other questions, we're going to be elaborating on this on our June 12th presentation to the RTC Commission this Thursday. Obviously, close at hand would be to complete the project concept report, which we anticipate being considered by the Commission in the fall for acceptance. And there's going to be continued engagement with the community and stakeholders throughout the summer months, as well as even after the project concept report is considered by the Commission in the fall. As Mark mentioned, we're going to always continue to look at state and federal funding sources, grant opportunities for completing the environmental document of this project, as well as looking for opportunities for identifying projects of independent utility along the branch line that we could seek grant funding for and make improvements or rehabilitations to the branch line to make it more competitive for these competitive discretionary funding sources. And Mark, there's one thing we added to that conversation earlier today when we were preparing for this Thursday presentation. I'm forgetting the additional item that we mentioned.
I'll have to admit that I am too.
Okay, I'll look at my notes here. I know I have it.
No, but I think it was really the conversation about continuing to work, particularly with Caltrans and the CID program.
That's right.
Because the Caltrans as a proponent in that program and the state of California being one of the few states that's very well organized in terms of how they're engaging in that conversation, is going to be there to help you through a process as an advocate for you, ultimately to achieve what you want to achieve in terms of this project in a way that is mutually beneficial, obviously, for the state and the other projects that make up, as Riley defined, what Caltrans refers to as the Central Coast Corridor. So that's a very big positive, because in the federal funding conversation, California has committed money, that it is a part of their commitment to that program and bringing more federal money into the program. And as a part of that, they're also making sure that the projects are advancing in a way that they're maximizing the opportunity from the program and able to move forward successfully.
Yeah, and I think something sparking in my mind about as we work with the Caltrans partners and our Central Coast Corridor partners to further develop the service development plan for the Central Coast Corridor. One big item that comes out of that process is our implementation program for service in the Central Coast Corridor, including the Santa Cruz Branch rail line. So that implementation program outlines the steps that are going to be needed to be undertaken in order to bring service on the corridor in line with the service development plan. So that implementation program really outlines the key steps that will need to happen in order to bring us into the next step of the program. So for instance, identifying key things on the Santa Cruz Branch rail line associated with governance and operators, as well as continuing to progress the environmental document, are things that our staff and our project team will be looking at. And as I mentioned, we will be presenting more on this topic on Thursday. So stay tuned, and we do invite everybody to come out to the meeting, either virtually or in person in Watsonville this Thursday evening, to get some additional information. But that does wrap us up for this evening. I do want to really appreciate everybody who participated today, all the questions that we had come through. As Tiffany mentioned, we had quite a number, our highest number of questions submitted, and we unfortunately weren't able to answer all of them this evening. But I've been taking notes, and so has the team. There are several things that I've identified, and the team has as well, that we can include in our presentation on Thursday and in materials that come out through the summer to answer some of these questions more specifically. To stay involved, we do invite everybody that's either participating with us this afternoon or who's viewing this presentation later, to sign up for our mailing list. If you would like to get the latest updates on the project, you can go to our project website, sccrtc.org/ZEPRT, to sign up for our mailing list, and also to get updates and visit the website for further information. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do have the virtual online open house that will be launching this week. That will be at ZEPRT.com. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Tiffany.
That sounds correct, yeah.
All right. And then you can email us at ZEPRT@sccrtc.org, or call into the office with any questions, and do participate in our upcoming open house office hours, where we invite you to come in and talk to the project team and ask your questions. This Thursday, we're providing some more information on those opportunities, as well as some specific dates. As those are finalized, we'll send those out to our mailing list and on our project website. So back to you, Tiffany, with the closing remarks.
Yeah, again, Riley said, but we really appreciate everybody's time this afternoon, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.